I don't know how to do it, but, for all of you Stanford students, I wish upon you, ample doses of pain and suffering.
NVIDIA has quickly become one of the most valuable companies on the planet. In a few years or even months, it could very well become the most valuable company. Jensen Huang has been running this company as the CEO and co-founder ever since its inception in the 90s. And in this video, he shares with us what his thoughts are on the keys to success. Let's watch.
Stanford has a lot of aspiring entrepreneurs. What advice would you give them to improve their chances of success?
I think one of my great advantages is that I have very low expectations. Most of the Stanford graduates have very high expectations. You deserve to have high expectations because you came from a great school. You were very successful. You're top of your class. Obviously, you were able to pay for tuition, and then you're graduating from one of the finest institutions on the planet. You're surrounded by other kids that are just incredible. You should have you naturally have very high expectations. People with very high expectations have very low resilience.
I'm sure, like me, you were a bit surprised to see someone, especially someone in his position, make a statement about how having low expectations is the key to success. There are two things he said that I think could be clarified a bit more. The first is, well, what I just said, that having low expectations is the key to success. And the second is that people with high expectations have low resilience. Let's unpack these. First of all, I really don't think he's encouraging us to have low expectations here, even though he did say that. I think what he's saying is not so much that high expectations equals low resilience, as much as it is that high expectations necessitates a higher amount of resilience to be successful. This is a subtle difference, but I think it makes a world of difference when considering whether having low expectations or higher resilience is more ideal for success. To try to put it more simply, we all know that the higher our expectations are, the worse the disappointment would feel if we're not able to live up to those expectations. So we all have two choices in this case: either lower our expectation or increase our resilience. The resilience is what it takes to weather those natural difficulties that comes along with failure. And mind you, without really having high expectations, we're not going to fail as much. So it's almost inevitable that by having high expectations, we're going to fail even more. And to be able to continue to do that and still get back up and keep pushing, we need to have a lot more resilience. This is why I think what he's really saying here when he talks about the key to success is that we should have a high amount of resilience if we're going to be able to maintain our high expectations.
And unfortunately, resilience matters in success. I don't know how to teach it to you except for I hope suffering happens to you. And I was fortunate that I grew up with my parents providing a condition for us to be successful on the one hand, but there were plenty of opportunities for setbacks and suffering, and and to this day, I use the phrase pain and suffering inside our company with great glee, and I mean that in a happy way. Because you want to refine the character of your company. You want greatness out of them, and greatness is not intelligence, as you know.
Jensen said, I use the phrase pain and suffering with glee because I want greatness out of them. If you needed any further proof that what he's talking about has much less to do with a lowering of expectations and more to do with an increase in resilience, then, well, there you have it. To want greatness is tantamount to expecting greatness. And I don't know about you, but that sounds like a pretty high expectation to me.
Greatness comes from character, and character isn't formed out of smart people. It's formed out of people who suffered. And so if I could wish upon you, I don't know how to do it, but for all of you Stanford students, I wish upon you, ample doses of pain and suffering.
I believe this is also the reason why hard work, it is said, trumps talent. Talent in this case meaning someone with a natural inclination for something. Through hard work, we're naturally able to develop the skills of resilience, whereas someone who's talented might actually have the extra hurdle of trying to learn resilience in the first place. The hard worker had to work for every inch of skill that they've acquired, a process that naturally builds resilience again. Whereas the talented person leapfrogged in the skills department and as such also leapfrogged all the resilience building process that was involved in that. Imagine a fighter who's been practicing for the past 20 years and he finally catches his break to make it onto the big stage, or a basketball team that made it all the way to the playoffs. For them to even get to that level, they would have had to encounter a lot of failures along the way that prepared them for the possibility of this ultimate failure, right? If they were to reach that point without that ability to be resilient, the type of failure that they would encounter could easily cripple them. But because of all the practice that they've put in, not just in their primary skill, but in the skill of resilience itself, they are that much more prepared. Not only does it take them that far, but they are that much more prepared to deal with those difficulties that come naturally with the possibility of failure and with failure itself. And the only way to build such resilience in a healthy way, as far as I can tell, is by having the high expectations that would expose us to all kinds of disappointments, both large and small, that continues to nurture that skill of resilience throughout our lives. I do want to hone into this point a little bit more about the relationship between suffering and resilience. And I want to do so with a quote from Viktor Frankl, who was a survivor of the World War II Nazi concentration camps. Frankl was an already established and well-respected psychiatrist even before he was sent to the concentration camps. So to say that his perspective on suffering is well-informed is really an understatement. This was a man who lost his father, his mother, his brother, and his wife, and still managed to keep his sanity in spite of all that he went through himself, to be able to reflect on what it means to suffer. As far as experiences that develop resilience go, you can imagine that it doesn't get any better than that, or I should say worse than that. So Viktor Frankl in his book Man's Search for Meaning talks about 3 ways, which that's a fantastic book, by the way. I would highly, highly recommend it. Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. He talks about 3 ways through which men find meaning in this world. The first of which is by creating or doing something. The second is by experiencing or encountering someone. And lastly, which is more the focus of this video, is in the attitude that we take towards unavoidable suffering. While I read this quote for you, try to keep in mind why someone like Jensen Huang would wish suffering as a way to build resilience. Quote, and this is a quote by Viktor Frankl, quote, "The third way of finding meaning in life is by suffering, the meaning of suffering. We must never forget that we may also find meaning in life even when confronted with a hopeless situation, when facing a fate that cannot be changed. For what then matters is to bear witness to the uniquely human potential at its best, which is to transform a personal tragedy into a triumph, to turn one's predicament into a human achievement. When we are no longer able to change a situation, just think of an incurable disease or an inoperable cancer, we are challenged to change ourselves. Let me cite a clear-cut example. Once an elderly general practitioner consulted me because of his severe depression. He could not overcome the loss of his wife, who had died 2 years before, and whom he had loved above all else. Now, how could I help him? What should I tell him? Well, I refrained from telling him anything, but instead confronted him with the question, "What would have happened, doctor, if you had died first and your wife would have had to survive you?" "Oh," he said, "for her this would have been terrible. How she would have suffered." Whereupon I replied, "You see, doctor, such a suffering has been spared her, and it was you who spared her this suffering. To be sure, at the price that now you have to survive and mourn her." He said no words, but shook my hand and calmly left the office. Some way, suffering ceases to be suffering at the moment it finds a meaning, such as the meaning of a sacrifice. Of course, this was no therapy in the proper sense, since first, his despair was no disease, and second, I could not change his fate. I could not revive his wife. But in that moment, I did succeed in changing his attitude toward an unalterable fate. And as much as from that time on, he could at least see a meaning in his suffering. It is one of the basic tenets of logotherapy that man's main concern is not to gain pleasure or to avoid pain, but rather to see a meaning in his life. That is why man is even ready to suffer, on the condition to be sure that his suffering has a meaning. But let me make it perfectly clear that in no way is suffering necessary to finding meaning. I only insist that meaning is possible even in spite of suffering, provided certainly that the suffering is unavoidable. If it were avoidable, however, the meaningful thing to do would be to remove its cause, be it psychological, biological, or political. To suffer unnecessarily is masochistic rather than heroic. End quote. Admittedly, a bit of a long paragraph if you're still with me, but I had a really hard time snipping out more than I had already. And again, reason why I would highly recommend this book, Man's Search for Meaning, if you're interested in reading further. But I thought it was all very essential to this point that's being made about the unique ability of suffering to create resilience. By intentionally exposing ourselves to suffering, whether that be through hard work or being disciplined or being reflective and mindful about the things that we do, obviously to a reasonable extent, we are better equipping ourselves to deal with the unexpected things that life could throw at us, such as the example of this gentleman who went to see Viktor Frankl about the loss of the very person that he cared about in this world. I imagine that that gentleman probably had a lot of difficult situations that he had to deal with in the past that equipped him to be able to deal with this loss as well as he seemed to. Even the mere ability to ask Viktor Frankl for help on dealing with this, I think was a huge show of resilience. And better yet, the ability to quickly understand the point that Victor was making about how to change his perspective on this to offer more meaning to the loss. I think that was very inspiring. For someone to be able to show such resilience in the face of such loss of hope and meaning in their lives, I imagine they're probably going to have a much easier time showing resilience in many other facets of life. And that is something that has to be a key to success, as Jensen Huang was saying. I think this is a testament to the power of suffering and adversity to build the character that is needed to make that journey towards whatever destination we call success.